right. Welcome all of you to our first episode of Corona classes. It's really disappointing to not be able to meet with you guys in person, but I've got my friend Dr. Brandon Bruning here with me to talk through the book of Ruth today with us. Now, I've mentioned Brandon a number of times in class. He holds a PhD from the University of Notre Dame in Hebrew Bible. His book is forthcoming from BIBL on the making of the Mishkan, which is the tabernacle, and he focuses on textual emendations in the book of Exodus. He has also been involved for the past couple of years with the Tantur Ecumenical Institute in Jerusalem, where he helps facilitate Jewish-Christian dialogue. He attends Sinai Synagogue in South Bend, Indiana, and he's generally just brilliant when it comes to everything about Hebrew Bible and Judaism, and he's my source for a lot of things. So if you've enjoyed this class this term and wondered how I know so much, I actually don't. Most of it's from Brandon. So I'm really excited to bring him to you in person today, and I've totally embarrassed him now, as you can all see. So Brandon, thank you so much for taking the time this morning to join me and chat through the book of Ruth.
Thank you, Jessica. Should I be saying Dr. Hughes? How do your students relate to you?
So we're actually at a Quaker school, which means it's all first names because of that radical egalitarianism coming from the 17th century. So I'm Jessica to everyone.
Well, that's wonderful. I'll feel just at home in as if I were in Israel, where everybody's on a first name basis. But that's because of the radical socialism. But that's
well, you know, Quakers might be into that too. All right. So when we talk about the book of Ruth, I think for a lot of students coming out of more conservative evangelical backgrounds, we first encounter this story in Sunday school classes, and it's a lovely marriage story, but we oftentimes don't think much about where it's come from, why it's been composed the way it has been. So I was wondering if you could maybe just talk us through a bit about the composition of this book, kind of where it fits in Jewish history, and how it's used today in Judaism.
Okay. So composition of the book is going to ask me to wear my Bible scholar hat, and then I'll switch hats, but you won't see it probably to where this fits in Jewish life. Scholars usually look at this and say, it's set in the time of the Judges. So it couldn't have been written before then, but there are a lot of features of the language that sound to people who know their biblical Hebrew the way that these and thous and thines sound in English. So it sounds old, but then the question is it actually old or is it archaizing? And it's probably archaizing because of a lot of the little features that sound kind of like when people use these and thous and thines in English, but they don't know what verbs to put with them. So that means that it was probably written sometime later. And then the question is, at what time would it make sense for somebody to tell this story? So that's lots of little clues there. Why have a story about a Moabite who becomes the ancestor of the king, the founder of the dynasty of Jerusalem, King David? And one of those things has to do with the law in Deuteronomy that says, no Moabite, no Ammonite to the 10th generation. And if you count at the genealogy at the end of the book of Ruth, it's a lot fewer than 10 generations till you get from Ruth to David. So
can I stop you right there, just to clarify? So what you're saying is that in the book of Deuteronomy, there's this absolute prohibition against marrying a Moabite.
Right.
10 generations. Like if you're a good Jew, you cannot have a Moabite in your family tree going back 10 full generations.
That's what it says.
And the book of Ruth, we have a marriage to a Moabite woman who's like the grandmother, great-grandmother to King David?
Grandmother of David, right. Right. So Ruth and Boaz, their child is Obed, right? Is it Obed and then Jesse and then David, right? So, yeah. So this would be a problem for the book of Deuteronomy. Now, when Deuteronomy, of course, is framed as the speech that Moses gives as sort of his last hurrah to the Israelites. They've been through the wilderness. They've gotten out of Egypt. They've been through the wilderness for 40 years. They're on the brink of crossing the Jordan and going. And at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, God says to Moses, you're not going, you'll give Joshua all of your leadership, and then I'll be with him, and then he'll lead the people, and you'll get to see the land from afar. So it's Moses' last words, and Moses reminds the people and sort of innovates a few things that you see earlier in the Torah. And he basically tells them, right, this is what happened when you came out of Egypt, right? God said not to do any harm to the Moabites or the Ammonites when you pass through their territory. You're not going to get their land. That's in Deuteronomy 2. But then within the body of the laws in Deuteronomy, the reminder is, don't intermarry with the Moabites or the Ammonites any more than with the Canaanite inhabitants of the land that you're going across the Jordan to possess.
So,
and that's a really, yeah.
Oh, I was going to say, so you've mentioned before to me that the law is given to protect something that's precious and something that's fragile, and in this case, the community relationships, but also the relationship of the community to God. So, can you maybe say a little bit more? I mean, it seems kind of I don't know, insensitive or cruel of a God to say you can't marry this group of people, right? Like they're off limits to you. So, how does this sort of marriage prohibition maybe fit into a bigger picture of how the law works in Deuteronomy?
So this has to do with dating the book of Deuteronomy, and I'm trying to answer the question
of dating the book of Ruth. Sorry, I already pulled you off topic.
I never know how to answer one of these questions because it always ends up answering another question. So one of the unique things about Deuteronomy versus the other books in the Torah is that it really makes very, very clear that there's only one place to worship. And it's the place that God will choose. It doesn't explicitly name the place. Mm-hmm. And early on, right, when the Israelites get out of Egypt in the book of Exodus and they get to Mount Sinai, and the divine appearance, the theophany on Mount Sinai, scares the Israelites, and they say, Moses, you go talk to God and we'll do the rest. Moses comes down with a law that begins with, only worship your God, but wherever you want, you build an altar of earth or of stone, and God will meet you in any of the places his name is invoked. Later on in the book of Exodus, the instructions become more specific to build a portable altar that's part of the portable sort of cultic, religious structure called the Mishkan or the Tabernacle, which you kindly mentioned as part of my work. And then the book of Leviticus takes that idea and expands it out to the rest of the Israelite tribes encamped around it in the wilderness, and imagines what that will look like as a sort of a map for how Israel will live in the land. Okay. And it's only in Deuteronomy that you then get the idea that there's only one altar at one place, right? You have any altar anywhere, and now in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers you have a single central shrine, but it's portable, right? So there's going to be one fixed address. God's going to have an address. And we don't know where God's address is, where we mail our prayers and our sacrifices, but that's the address. Mm-hmm. So Deuteronomy is really, 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 really emphatic about that point. And it's really, really emphatic about, therefore, getting rid of any worship that looks like the worship that the Canaanites give to their gods. So when you go into the land, destroy all of the Canaanite places of worship and don't learn their ways of worship, right? That's the idea, right? So the idea is that anything that will sort of deter you from going to this one place to bring everybody together, this idea that a central place becomes sort of the social and religious and spiritual glue for the people. Mm-hmm. Really, really important for Deuteronomy, and it doesn't want anything compromised with that. So not treating your God like the other nations treat their gods means don't have lots of places to worship, don't have lots of places to bring your sacrifices, don't learn their ways. And so that's part of its anxiety about intermarrying with the peoples who already lived in the land before. It just doesn't want anything to compromise that idea that the one place where God is to be worshipped is in question.
So one of the big issues we start to see here then is the issue around identity. And how do you form a people? What does it mean to be a part of this people and not a part of that people over there? And so worshiping in one place, having kind of an anchor or a center that draws everyone together is a part of that. And then not participating in relationships that will take you outside of that people or have a way of maybe influencing your cultural practice or your religious practice in such a way that identity is compromised. So it seems that as we watch Israel starting to kind of form as Israel here, as the people, the concern is to protect this unique thing that they have by saying, you've got to be careful who you're in relationship with. You've got to be careful what you do, where you worship, how you worship, because for you guys to be you and not them, you need to kind of protect this very special thing that's happening between God and the people. Is that a fair way to summarize that?
Yes, and it's sort of like the George Washington speech warning future American governments not to form too many foreign alliances. It's that kind of idea, right? I mean, Moses becomes the founding figure, kind of like a George Washington, and if you read through the history of Israel that's presented in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, those books that scholars like to call the Deuteronomistic history, and that the Jewish canon call the former earlier prophets, it takes those unique ideas that are in Deuteronomy and sort of plays those out as a model for how the history of Israel in the land, through the tribes in the land forming a kingdom, and then the kingdom, northern and southern kingdoms. And Solomon's a great example of that, right? He builds the temple, right? And it's assumed that must be the place Deuteronomy was talking about. But Solomon keeps building temples. Why? Because he marries so many foreign wives, right? Which is how the ancient kings made their alliances, right? They all married each other.
As my husband will tell you, you have to be very careful of those foreign wives, man. I mean, this is what happens when you marry a foreigner. You end up living in places like South Bend, Indiana for 10 years. So there might be some wisdom in that.
We should bring Andrew in on this conversation.
We should, yeah. How did that go for you marrying a foreign woman? And we have similar problems when we get to the book of Ruth in terms of the marrying of a foreigner.
Right. So the context for the book of Ruth uses that whole idea, right? Kind of making some kind of a statement that looks like it counters the law in Deuteronomy for making some kind of an argument over what it means to be Israel. And so if you look at the books that tell the story after the book of Kings, which ends with the exile into Babylon, the Persians come along and conquer the Babylonians and tell the Judeans who are in exile that they can go home. And that's what the book of Ezra begins with King Cyrus of Persia saying, anybody who wants to go home to Judah and rebuild the house of their God, let them go up and do that, right? And so Ezra is not one of the first people to go back. There's a whole story of a whole generation that goes back and tries to rebuild and has some success and some not, and some trouble with the folks who have been living there all along or who have moved in the meantime. And those debates sort of are the backdrop for Ezra's later mission to go back. And Ezra is really important for understanding the narrative for the book of Ruth. Yeah. A lot of scholars see Ruth as almost as a kind of allegory, I guess, for the time in which all of these debates over who is legitimately Israel in this time of rebuilding and returning from exile and repairing what was lost. Yeah. Ezra gets to Jerusalem, and among other things, I'm just looking here in Ezra chapter 9, he says that the officers approached me and saying, the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the land, whose abhorrent practices are like those of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. Now, that long list of people, aside from Egyptians, right? Those are all the people, right, of the narrative of the Exodus, and the wilderness wandering, and the entry into the land. There aren't Canaanites and Hittites and Jebusites around anymore, right? Jerusalem was the old Jebusite city that different people took. David, the last one. So Ezra is activating the story of the exodus from Egypt and the entry into the land, and meanwhile the bringing of God's law from Mount Sinai into the land as his narrative. That legitimizes what he's doing, and that means that the people who are living in the land, who are not part of the returnee group, he calls them Canaanites. So this is the question, right? We learn from the Book of Kings, right, that when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and his officers took exiles away from Judah, right, it has this very hyperbolic language, like all the people of the land. Oh, but then he left, right, all of these other people behind, as basically the folks who make the economy still work, so that there's tribute to be sent to Babylon.
Right, because you don't want to lose the tax income.
Yeah, the tax base, the people who dig the ditches and raise the crops and all the rest of it. So it means that really the people who are exiled are really the elites. The folks who were part of the aristocracy, the scribal classes, some of the artisans, people who would be useful to the Babylonians by centralizing them over toward Babylonia.
But they were all Israelites.
So they're all Judahites, they're all Judahite Israelites, right? And so the folks who are still left behind in the land during the exile for some 70 years, plus the generations or so that have been back since between Cyrus's decree and Ezra's return, these folks probably have thought of themselves as Israelites. And even the folks who maybe didn't have an Israelite, quote unquote pedigree, they've adopted that.
Okay.
Because that's where they live.
Yeah.
Those are the sort of cultural places that are touchstones for their identity. So you got different people claiming to be Israelite in two different ways. And Ezra's group says, we are the returnees. We know we're the pedigree because we have, our priest lines and our king lines, and we're the ones coming back to reestablish the old kingdom of Judah. And we're not just doing the old kingdom of Judah, we're bringing back all of this stuff. We are just like the generation from Moses to Joshua to the Judges. And the problem with the story from Moses to Joshua to Judges, if you read from Deuteronomy and Joshua to Judges, is that Moses gives the people the law and warns them, do everything right and everything will go well. And Joshua leads the people and they, do everything according to what Moses said, and everything is grand and glorious, and they seem like they're well ensconced in the land and things are going well. And then Joshua dies in the book of Judges. Once Joshua's funeral is over, all the people kind of go and they do the things that Deuteronomy prohibits. They interact with and marry the people of the lands around them, and they worship their God the way those people worship their gods, and they worship their gods, and all the other things, and everything goes totally, everything's verkauft. So Ezra sees this as the reason why things aren't going well in the restoration of Judah. And so he says, these people are Canaanites, we should separate from them. And what's the other response to that? You get that probably in like Isaiah 56. Most scholars see Isaiah as having at least 2 parts and maybe 3 parts. There's a section that really talks about Cyrus as the Messiah, right? This is the return under the Persians. And then Isaiah 56 talks about who has access to the temple. So the temple is actually rebuilt by this point. And there's the argument over, let not the foreigner say, I have no past with the people, right? I have no ancestor. Let not the eunuch, right, who has no ability to create descendants, right? I have no one to inherit me in the land. Let neither of them say that they don't belong. It reorganizes belonging around the temple and around devotion to God. So it sounds to many people like it's an argument against Ezra's party and Ezra's policies.
Yeah.
So who's arguing against Ezra, and why would Ezra be using this Deuteronomistic idea, which would include no Moabites, no Canaanites? And that's why a lot of people say, oh, that might make sense for the context for Ruth. Now that's one argument, and it's not the only one, but it's a predominant one among scholars.
Right. And so just to kind of summarize then, you've got this, well, I mean, there's a lot of biblical history we've just covered, right? I mean, we've basically done everything from Deuteronomy to the return from exile in about 5 minutes.
That was generous.
So you've got a return from exile in which people returning are traditionally the upper class, the educated class, the people who were the elites. And they're coming back to the land saying, we've got all this figured out and right. And the people who were left behind, who had also considered themselves to be Judeans, they are now being kind of ostracized and othered as no longer having a part of this, even though historically, if we're being fair, they probably did have a part of it. They were just more what we would call the working class today. So you've got a sort of class tension that is being discussed along racial and religious lines of identity.
Yeah.
But all around who's in, who's out, who gets to be a part of this new restoration of Israel that God seems to be potentially doing through Cyrus and through Ezra's leadership.
Yeah.
What does this look like? And God has been somewhat silent in all of this, right? We haven't had, it's not quite a Sinai sort of moment where God is speaking directly to any of these folks, telling them what to do. So everyone's kind of claiming God's on my side, but it's not quite clear where God is. And so into this question of race and religion and economic identity, you have a little story, a little love story about Ruth and Boaz, where we seem to be suggesting that perhaps the right reading, or the right way to understand whatever's going on in Deuteronomy and whatever it means to be Israel, maybe doesn't look like drawing the sorts of lines that Ezra is drawing, but maybe looks like something around personal devotion, practicing a sort of loving kindness or chesed toward the other, and maybe a pathway toward incorporation that we can even link all the way back to King David, which then gives it like historical authority, because if David's great-grandma could be a Moabite, well, right, then maybe there's room for us to find a way to build a new and more inclusive, for lack of a better word, community that's still not to say inclusive isn't like we're going to welcome in Moabite gods or anything, but
right,
that there's a pathway toward being part of Israel.
It's not a 21st century secular pluralism, but it is an argument for, hey, who belongs, who's part of this project.
Right.
The builders of temples in the ancient world are kings.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Solomon, right? David once, right? When David says, okay, to be a king means I'm supposed to build a temple, right? And the prophet comes to him and says, nice idea, but God's going to build you a house, and that'll be your dynasty. And so your son will build me the house. And so Solomon's temple gets the credit for being the temple building, right? So who then restores temples, who maintains temples, right? Kings are supposed to do that. Because the king is sort of, if gods in the ancient world create the order that makes life work, right? The seasons come in their order, the crops and everything, and the flocks have life. They do that by defeating and maintaining and managing chaos. And the kings do the same thing in the social sphere. So the king is kind of like the god. So the king has a responsibility to maintain the temple. And when Cyrus says you can go back and rebuild the temple, that's why he's called in Isaiah 45 the Messiah, which is the title for the anointed kings of the Davidic line. So the book of Isaiah reuses that Davidic language and applies it to Cyrus, because it recognizes Cyrus as the one whose role it is to be responsible ultimately for rebuilding the temple. Mm-hmm. But in the prophet's Haggai and Zechariah, who are mentioned in the first chapters of Ezra, they see a descendant of David, Zerubbabel, as the one who's responsible directly, right, for rebuilding the temple, because the Persians appoint him to help rebuild. So that gets people like the prophets Haggai and Zechariah really, really excited that maybe it's not just we get to go home and be a nice little semi-autonomous part of the Persian Empire, but maybe the Persian Empire is going to become now the empire, you know, maybe Zerubbabel is going to refound the Davidic dynasty and make the Davidic dynasty the king of the entire Persian Empire. Of course, we never hear any more about Zerubbabel. So historically, that seems to have been a dead end.
Okay, so it seems like there's lots of tension then, like, or lots of potential people kind of making like power grabs or seeing, I mean, it's a bit like Game of Thrones, right? There's all these potential people who could end up in charge. Some people kind of coalesce around one leader, some around another leader.
Right.
And then we get the Book of Ruth kind of, it seems like, intervening into all of this as a sort of narrative counterweight to maybe problematic readings or overly zealous exclusionary readings, correct? But like if we place it.
Yeah, I think one, I mean, given the place where I'm placing it would be that it's part of a conversation about not just restoring the people in a place where their ancestors had sort of ancestral connections, and not just even about rebuilding the temple, but it's really about what are we doing as sort of this outlying province under the Persian Empire, right? Ezra's prayer says, you know, we've sinned for all of our ancestors' history. Mm-hmm. Now we've got a chance to get it right. And he doesn't talk about restoring the Davidic dynasty, right? But he does talk about it in terms of loyalty to God's Torah, to God's law.
Right.
And of course, like anybody, right, he means as he understands it.
Of course.
And so, but yeah, Ruth would be part of these conversations using all of this David stuff, right, has been part of the backdrop before Ezra shows up in Jerusalem. Are we going to get a Davidic empire? Are we going to get sovereignty back? Are we going to remain part of the Persian Empire or not? And that's what all the Davidic stuff is doing, I think, in the backdrop of Ruth, to say, okay, we want our own kingdom back. We want Davidic rule. We want all of that stuff. Here's the story, right? Here's where this comes from.
Okay, so this is the story that makes it possible. Now,
right.
The reason in terms of like modern Jewish practice to think about Ruth as somehow like almost functioning as a narrative interpretive lens for Deuteronomy, in terms of when it's read publicly, correct?
Yes. So not only do we have that kind of historical question of, is Ruth written kind of in response to how Ezra is using Deuteronomy in that moment, but liturgically, the rabbis read Ruth as one of 5 scrolls that are read at 5 different times in the liturgical year, and we read Ruth during the celebration of Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, Christian Pentecost. It's in the Torah, there's the Feast of Weeks. It just says you count 7 weeks from the beginning of the barley harvest. That's the setting for Ruth. And at the end of that, there's a big festival of gathering in the barley harvest. It's the first harvest of the year. It's the first grain to come up. It starts right around now and goes for a few more weeks. What's not explicitly connected in the Torah itself, but through the Second Temple period, so from the Persian to the Hellenistic period and so forth, the Feast of Shavuot or Pentecost gets explicitly tied to the Israelites' arrival at Sinai. So you see at Exodus 19 when Israel gets to Sinai, right? It says they arrived at Sinai in the 3rd month. So if you have the Passover is the new moon, which is the middle of the 1st month, and you go 7 more weeks, you're into the 3rd month. So the giving of the Torah and the making of the covenant at Sinai, right, is connected to this festival that has a very agrarian, right, meaning in the sort of cyclical counting of time. We have a linear time of the Exodus story. We have the circular cyclical time of the year, which is the agrarian cycle. And so different points on those get sort of matched up to each other. And so the idea of having a sort of love story here with Ruth and Boaz, right, and the making of a family and the making of a marriage, right, these are also metaphors for the divine love for Israel and the divine courting of Israel. And the rabbis love to have this sort of, you know, we read the Song of Songs at during the week of Passover, which kicks off that 7 weeks of counting to Shavuot. So we get out of Egypt and we get to Sinai, right? The Egypt narrative is always, let my people go so that they may worship me, so that they may serve me. And the rabbis read that as one big love story, and the song that God and Israel sing to each other is the Song of Songs. And you end up then at Sinai, and they have this beautiful story of Ruth, which is set at the time of the barley harvest, which is also the time for the making of the covenant, the marriage covenant between God and God's people.
Okay, so I mean, as a literary scholar, I love all the resonances there. You've got barley harvest and Ruth, but you've also got then this connection of the giving of the law and the giving of like the first fruits of the harvest. This idea of like life coming from bread, but also life coming from Torah, and this sort of beautiful play on the Word of God and bread being so tangibly linked in that sort of liturgical observance. That's really cool. So Ruth comes into all of this, but also in a way that's tense, right? Because again, this very law that's been given that you're not supposed to marry the Moabites, the story that we read to celebrate the giving of the law is a story about marrying a Moabite.
Right.
So there's this fabulous sort of contradiction there as well. That's quite, I mean, I kind of love that's like put in place liturgically, that sort of tension, right? That like, we're going to celebrate, we received Torah, and we're going to read a story about apparently doing something against Torah to celebrate the giving of Torah. There's a fun sort of tension we're invited into, and that's something that in this class we've been talking about a lot, sort of the ways in which time and again we see Israel being invited to wrestle with God, be it Abraham and God debating how many righteous people need to be found in Sodom in order to save it, or be it Jacob wrestling with the angel, or Moses arguing with God on Sinai about you actually can't go and destroy your people and start over with me. That's not on. But we see this over and over again. And so we see, it feels like a sort of a similar tension here between the law in Deuteronomy and Ruth, and this kind of fabulous creative thing of, so what does it mean to live this authentically and well, what we're given in Deuteronomy? Well, here's a story that maybe helps us to see how we live it well, and it maybe doesn't quite look like what we thought it ought to look like, but in a way that's good and exciting and generative.